Greed, racism, and the moment justice finally caught up with a man who thought he was untouchable. Watch as one judge's powerful verdict changed everything. The morning air in downtown Chicago was crisp, but inside the federal courthouse tension simmered like a pot about to boil. Camera crews lined the steps, their lenses focused on the building where one of the most anticipated trials of the year was about to reach its climax. The case had everything the media loved: a wealthy defendant, devastated victims, and accusations that went far beyond simple fraud. The courtroom was packed to capacity. Every seat filled, every eye focused on the defendant's table where Harrison Vale sat with the kind of casual arrogance that money and power often breed. At 62, Vale still carried himself like the real estate titan he'd been for decades. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his Italian suit probably cost more than most people made in a month, and his expression suggested he viewed the entire proceeding as little more than an inconvenience. Harrison Vale wasn't just any real estate developer. He was the kind of man whose name appeared on buildings across 3 states, whose empire had been built one property, one deal, one family at a time. But behind the gleaming towers and luxury developments lay a darker truth. For 20 years, Vale had been systematically targeting Black and Latino families, forcing them from their homes through predatory practices that walked the razor's edge of legality until they crossed into outright crime. The prosecution had spent weeks laying out his method. Vale's company would identify neighborhoods with high concentrations of minority families, then deploy tactics designed to make their lives unbearable. Sudden rent increases that violated lease agreements, maintenance requests that went unanswered for months, leaving families without heat in winter or working plumbing, false eviction notices served without proper legal justification. When families couldn't pay the inflated rents or tolerate the deteriorating conditions, they were forced to leave. Vale would then renovate the properties and rent them to white tenants at even higher rates. But Vale's operation went deeper than simple displacement. His team had also been caught fabricating credit reports, inflating income requirements, and using coded language in rental advertisements that effectively excluded minority applicants. When confronted with evidence, Vale had dismissed it all as smart business practice. To him, these weren't families with children and dreams and decades of memories in their homes. They were obstacles to profit margins. The evidence was staggering. Bank records showing systematic discrimination, email chains where Vale and his employees used racial slurs and discussed strategies for cleaning up neighborhoods. Testimony from former employees who had grown disgusted with the company's practices and decided to come forward. But perhaps most damning were the hundreds of families whose lives had been shattered by Vale's greed. The courtroom had heard from dozens of them over the past 3 weeks. Maria Santos, a grandmother who had been forced from her apartment of 15 years when Vale's company claimed she owed back rent that had actually been paid. The Santos family had been split up, with Maria living in her car while her grandchildren stayed with relatives across the city. James Washington, a veteran who had lost his home when Vale's team claimed his disability payments didn't constitute legitimate income. The Washington family now lived in a shelter, their credit destroyed, their future uncertain. Each testimony had been heartbreaking, but through it all, Harrison Vale had remained unmoved. He scrolled through his phone during emotional moments, whispered jokes to his legal team when families broke down in tears, and generally conducted himself as though their pain was nothing more than background noise to his real life. The press had noted. Headlines screamed about his callous behavior, his apparent lack of remorse, the way he seemed to view his victims as less than human. But Vale didn't care about public opinion. He'd weathered media storms before. In his experience, wealth was the ultimate shield, and he had more than enough to protect himself from any consequences. What he hadn't counted on was Judge Amara Washington. Judge Washington was everything Harrison Vale wasn't. Where he was flashy, she was understated. Where he demanded attention, she commanded respect through quiet authority. At 54, she had spent her entire career fighting for justice, first as a civil rights attorney, then as a prosecutor, and finally as a federal judge known for her integrity and her refusal to be intimidated by wealth or power. She was also Black. Vale had made no secret of his displeasure when Judge Washington was assigned to his case. His lawyers had immediately filed motions requesting a different judge, claiming potential bias. When those motions were denied, Vale had made increasingly disparaging comments to reporters about activist judges and political correctness run amok. The subtext was clear to everyone, including Judge Washington herself, but she had handled cases like this before. She knew that men like Harrison Vale saw her presence on the bench not as a symbol of justice, but as a personal affront to their sense of natural order. She also knew that her response to his inevitable provocations would set the tone not just for this trial, but for every similar case that followed. The moment that would define everything came on the trial's final day. Judge Washington entered the courtroom for sentencing as she always did, with quiet dignity and unmistakable authority. The bailiff's voice rang out clear and strong. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Amara Washington." The entire courtroom stood as one. Prosecutors, defense attorneys, court staff, journalists, and the gallery filled with Vale's victims all rose to their feet in the traditional show of respect for the court's authority. All except Harrison Vale. He remained seated at the defendant's table, casually flipping through a legal pad as though the judge's entrance was irrelevant to him. His lead attorney, a nervous man named Preston, who had been trying unsuccessfully to manage his client's behavior throughout the trial, leaned in with urgent whispers. But Vale waved him off with the same dismissive gesture he'd been using for weeks. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. 200 people standing in respect while one man sat in defiance. Judge Washington paused at her bench, her expression unreadable. She had dealt with disrespectful defendants before, but this was different. This wasn't ignorance or nervous. This was calculated disrespect, a deliberate challenge to her authority based on nothing more than the color of her skin. For a moment that felt like an eternity, judge and defendant locked eyes. Vale's expression was smug, almost daring her to react. He had spent his entire life believing that his wealth made him untouchable, that his success gave him the right to treat others, especially black women, as beneath his notice. Judge Washington's voice when she finally spoke was calm, measured, and absolutely deadly in its quiet authority. "You may be seated," she said to the courtroom, but her eyes never left Vale's face. The room settled into their chairs, but the tension remained thick as smoke. Everyone could feel that something significant had just happened, though they couldn't yet know how significant. But this was only the beginning. Harrison Vale was about to learn that some people refuse to be diminished, no matter how much money you have or how entitled you believe yourself to be. The trial had been a masterclass in prosecutorial thoroughness. Lead prosecutor Jennifer Chen had methodically dismantled Vale's operation, revealing the systematic nature of his discrimination and the devastating impact on hundreds of families. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showing clear patterns of racial bias, recorded phone calls where Vale and his employees discussed strategies for removing minority tenants, and testimony from former employees who had grown sick of participating in what they recognized as organized racism, disguised as business. But it was the victim testimonies that had truly revealed the human cost of Vale's empire. Maria Santos had taken the stand on day 12 of the trial. At 73, she had lived in the same Chicago apartment for nearly 2 decades, watching the neighborhood change around her, but maintaining her small piece of stability in an uncertain world. Her English was heavily accented, but perfectly clear as she described the day Vale's company took over her building. "They come to me," she testified, her voice trembling but strong, "and they say I owe money I never owed. They say my rent is different now, more money, but my lease says no. When I show them my lease, they laugh. They say, 'We don't care what your paper says, old woman. Pay or get out.'" The prosecutor had walked her through the months that followed. Maintenance requests ignored, heat shut off in December, water pressure reduced to a trickle, phone calls from Vale's employees at all hours, sometimes with explicit threats, sometimes with racial slurs, all designed to make her life unbearable until she gave up and left. "I stay because this is my home," Maria had said, tears streaming down her face. "My husband, he died in that apartment. My grandchildren, They learn to walk on that floor, but they make it so I cannot live. They break my spirit piece by piece until I have nothing left. The courtroom had been silent except for the sound of Maria's quiet sobs and the scratch of reporters' pen. But Harrison Vale had been scrolling through his phone, occasionally smirking at something he found amusing. The contrast was stark and damning. James Washington's testimony had been equally powerful. A decorated Army veteran who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, Washington had been living with his wife and 2 young children in a Vale-owned property when the harassment began. His disability payments from the VA were substantial and reliable, but Vale's company had suddenly declared them insufficient income verification and demanded additional documentation that didn't exist. "I fought for this country," Washington had said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I took shrapnel for this flag. And this man," he pointed directly at Vale, "he looked at my service record, my medals, my sacrifice, and he decided I wasn't good enough to live in his building because of the color of my skin." The prosecutor had introduced evidence showing that white tenants with lower incomes and less reliable income sources had been approved for similar units during the same time period. The discrimination was so blatant it would have been almost comical if the consequences hadn't been so devastating. "My kids had to switch schools 3 times," Washington continued. "My wife had to quit her job because we kept moving further and further from her work. We went from a stable family building a future to people living paycheck to paycheck, apartment to apartment, never knowing if we'd have a home next month." Through it all, Vale maintained his posture of bored indifference. He doodled on legal pads, whispered with his attorneys, and generally acted as though the testimonies were happening in another room. The victim's pain was irrelevant to him. Their stories were just noise. The pattern had continued for 3 weeks. Witness after witness, family after family, each one describing how Vale's systematic discrimination had destroyed their lives. And through it all, Vale's message was clear. These people, their pain, their humanity meant nothing to him. Judge Washington had watched it all with growing disgust. She had presided over hundreds of cases involving terrible people doing terrible things, but there was something particularly nauseating about Vale's combination of massive harm and complete indifference. He wasn't just a criminal, he was a criminal who viewed his victims as subhuman, but she had maintained her composure, followed proper procedures, and ensured that both sides received fair hearings. The law was the law, regardless of her personal feelings about the defendant. Now, as she prepared to deliver sentencing, Judge Washington knew that her words would be scrutinized by legal scholars, civil rights organizations, and communities across the country. This wasn't just about Harrison Vale. This was about whether the justice system would finally hold accountable the wealthy and powerful who believed themselves above consequences. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity for sentencing day. Reporters filled the back rows, their cameras ready to capture every moment. The gallery was crowded with Vale's victims, their faces showing a mixture of hope and skepticism born from decades of watching rich defendants walk away with slaps on the wrist. Vale himself looked as confident as ever. His legal team had filed extensive sentencing memoranda, arguing for leniency based on his contributions to the community and his lack of prior criminal convictions. They had painted him as a misunderstood businessman who had made mistakes but didn't deserve serious punishment. Judge Washington took her time reviewing the case file one final time. The evidence was overwhelming. The harm was massive. The defendant had shown no remorse whatsoever. Under federal sentencing guidelines, she had broad discretion in determining punishment. She also had the power to send a message. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of history and the promise of justice. "Miss Vale," she began, her eyes fixed on the defendant who had once again remained seated when she entered the courtroom. "You have been found guilty on all counts of housing discrimination, conspiracy, fraud, and civil rights violation. The evidence against you is not just overwhelming, it is damning." Vale leaned back in his chair, his expression unchanged. His attorneys had clearly prepared him for harsh words. They expected judicial theater followed by a manageable sentence. They were wrong. Over the course of 20 years, Judge Washington continued, "You systematically targeted families based solely on the color of their skin. You displaced hundreds of people from their homes. You destroyed community. You separated children from their schools, grandparents from their neighborhoods, families from their roots. The judge's voice grew stronger, more commanding. But perhaps most telling is your behavior throughout this trial. You have shown complete contempt for your victims, for this court, and for the very concept of justice. You have treated the testimonies of families whose lives you destroyed as entertainment. You have mocked their pain and dismissed their humanity. Vale's smirk was beginning to fade. Something in the judge's tone suggested this wasn't going according to his lawyer's predictions. Mr. Vale, you seem to believe that your wealth places you above the law, that your success gives you the right to treat others as less than human. Today you will learn that you are wrong. The courtroom was dead silent. Even the reporters had stopped writing. Therefore, Judge Washington declared, her voice ringing with authority, I sentence you to 35 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted gasps from the gallery, shocked whispers from reporters, and for the first time in the entire trial, genuine emotion from Harrison Vale. His face went white, his mouth falling open in disbelief. But Judge Washington wasn't finished. Furthermore, I am ordering the complete liquidation of your real estate empire. Every property, every asset, every dollar will be sold and the proceeds distributed to your victims. You will also pay punitive damages of $50 million to establish a housing assistance fund for families affected by discrimination. Vale shot to his feet, his composure finally cracking completely. You can't do this, he shouted, his voice echoing through the courtroom. I'm Harrison Vale. I built this city. You're nothing but a... He caught himself before completing the sentence. But everyone in the room knew exactly what word he had been about to use. Judge Washington's gavel came down like thunder. You will show respect in my courtroom, or you will be held in contempt. But Vale was beyond rational thought. The reality of losing everything was hitting him like a physical blow. This is a joke, he screamed. You think you can destroy me? I'll appeal this. I'll have your job. You people need to learn your place. The words hung in the air like poison. You people. The mask had finally slipped completely. As Judge Washington stood, her presence filling the courtroom with quiet authority. Bailiffs, she commanded, remove Mr. Vale from my courtroom. And Mr. Vale, she waited until his eyes met hers. I know exactly what my place is. My place is on this bench, ensuring that justice is served regardless of a defendant's wealth, power, or prejudice. Your place is in federal prison, where you will have 35 years to contemplate the lives you destroyed. As Vale was led away in handcuffs, still screaming threats and obscenities, the courtroom erupted in applause. Judge Washington allowed it for a moment before bringing order back to her court. But the real story was just beginning. The reverberations from Vale's sentencing were immediate and far-reaching. Within hours, news of the 35-year sentence was trending on social media. Legal experts were calling it one of the harshest sentences ever handed down for housing discrimination. Civil rights leaders were hailing it as a watershed moment. Maria Santos, standing on the courthouse steps with tears in her eyes, spoke to reporters with a voice stronger than it had been in months. For so long, I think maybe nobody care about people like me, she said. But today, Judge Washington, she show us that we matter, that our homes matter, that our families matter. James Washington was equally emotional. I served this country because I believed in justice, he told the cameras. Today, Judge Washington proved that my faith wasn't misplaced. She didn't just sentence Harrison Vale. She sent a message to every landlord, every developer, every person who thinks they can profit from racism. The financial impact on Vale was devastating. His real estate empire, built over decades, was dismantled within months. Properties were sold, assets liquidated, and the proceeds distributed to his victims. Many families were able to buy homes for the first time. Others used the money to restart businesses that had failed when they lost their housing. Maria Santos put a down payment on a small house with a garden where she could grow the tomatoes her late husband had loved. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the legal system itself. Vale's sentence became precedent, referenced in housing discrimination cases across the country. Prosecutors began pursuing cases they might have previously considered too difficult. Defense attorneys could no longer assume that wealthy clients would receive minimal punishment for crimes against minority communities. 6 months after sentencing, Judge Washington received a letter from a young law student at Howard University. "Dear Judge Washington," it read, "I watched your sentencing of Harrison Vale on live television. I saw a powerful man try to intimidate you based on nothing but his prejudice and your race. I saw you stand firm and deliver justice anyway. Because of you, I'm going to specialize in civil rights law. Because of you, I believe the system can work. Thank you for showing me what courage looks like." The letter was signed by hundreds of law students across the country. Judge Washington kept the letter in her desk drawer, pulling it out on difficult days when the weight of her responsibilities felt overwhelming. She knew that her sentence of Harrison Vale had been about more than one man's crimes. It had been about the principle that justice must be blind to wealth and power, that the law must protect the vulnerable from the predatory, and that sometimes the most important verdicts are the ones that say clearly and definitively. Harrison Vale served his sentence at a federal penitentiary in rural Illinois, far from the gleaming towers that had once borne his name. His appeals were denied at every level. His former employees testified against him in exchange for reduced sentence. His empire was completely dismantled, its profits finally flowing to the families he had tried to destroy. He never showed remorse. Even in prison, he maintained that he was the victim of political correctness and judicial overreach. He spoke to anyone who would listen about the unfairness of his treatment, the bias of his judge, impossibility of doing business in an environment where you can't even look at demographics anymore. But nobody was listening. The man who had once commanded boardrooms and bent city councils to his will was now just another inmate in an orange jumpsuit, serving time for crimes he still refused to acknowledge. Meanwhile, the families he had displaced continued rebuilding their lives. Children who had been forced to change schools multiple times were now graduating from universities. Parents who had lost their businesses were opening new ones. Grandparents who had been separated from their communities were reunited with lifelong friends. The Housing Assistance Fund, established by Judge Washington's order, helped thousands of families beyond Vale's direct victims. It provided down payment assistance, legal aid for tenants facing discrimination, and emergency housing for families in crisis. Judge Washington continued serving on the federal bench, her reputation for fairness and courage drawing cases from across the region. She never spoke publicly about the Vale case beyond the official proceedings, but her message had been clear and lasting. In her courtroom, justice would not be for sale. Years later, when law students studied landmark cases in civil rights and housing law, they would read transcripts of Vale vs. United States and learn about the day a judge looked a wealthy, powerful, racist defendant in the eye and said simply, "Not in my courtroom." The case became more than legal precedent. It became proof that the arc of justice, however long and curved, could still bend toward equality when courageous people in positions of authority chose to do what was right rather than what was easy. As for Harrison Vale himself, he remained in federal prison, a forgotten footnote to a story that was ultimately about something much larger than his crimes. It was about dignity, respect, and the radical idea that justice should be the same for everyone, regardless of the color of their skin or the size of their bank account. And in a small house with a garden in Chicago, Maria Santos tends tomatoes and knows that somewhere, somehow, justice is still possible. So as you think about this story, ask yourself, what does justice look like in your community? What would you do if you had the power to choose between what's easy and what's right? Because in the end, justice isn't just the responsibility of judges and lawyers. It's something all of us have to fight for, every day, in every interaction, until the day when no one has to wonder whether their race will determine their treatment under the law. That day hasn't come yet. But thanks to people like Judge Amara Washington, it's a little bit closer than it was before.